Welcome to the Research Works podcast, brought to you in association with the Healthy Strides Foundation. Your hosts are Dr. Dana Poole
and Dr. Ashley Thornton, and we're here to interview world-leading researchers, clinicians and people with lived experience
to support your practice in being more evidence-based.
Hello everyone, welcome back. It's another week and that means another episode of the Research Works podcast.
It's the best time of the week. Come on, you all know it, right? Always good to be here. And today on the pod we actually have a returning guest, which is always the best thing,
We love
isn't it?
Returning guests.
They're
It means we haven't scared them off.
I know, that's right, that's right. And the best thing about this is it carries on from the research that we discussed last time. And I love that we can do this. So welcome back, Dr. Michelle Jackman. Hello.
Oh, hi guys. Thanks so much for having me back.
Oh, thank you for returning,
yes.
Michelle.
Yeah, glad you said yes. Thank you.
So today you are here to talk to us about your team's recent publication, which was titled Implementing Clinical Practice Guidelines for Improving Function in Cerebral Palsy, Development of a Fidelity Tool, which was published in Pediatric Physical Therapy earlier this year, 2025. So I think we can consider that to be hot off the press.
Absolutely. Yes, indeed.
And as Dana said, that's a really nice continuation of the work that we talked to you about last time you were on the show. But we'll get into that, I think, a little bit more later on. But before we do that, we need to tell all of our listeners a bit about Michelle. Dr. Michelle Jackman is a clinician researcher who works clinically in the neonatal intensive care unit at the John Hunter Children's Hospital, which is in Newcastle, New South Wales. And she also works as a senior research fellow with the Cerebral Palsy Research Institute in Sydney, New South Wales. Michelle's research has focused on improving function in cerebral palsy, including leading international guidelines that were published in 2021. Michelle has been invited to present her research on an international stage across 5 continents. She is passionate about family-centred care and translating evidence that leads to real-life changes for the children and families that we work with.
That's the best kind of bio. You're just doing it, right?
That's it. Just getting on with it.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. I love it. Everything about it.
Yeah. So, Michelle, that's the formal getting to know you. We obviously like to do a bit more of an informal getting to know you as well. And our icebreaker question for today is, if you could instantly master one completely useless skill, what would it be? And we've talked a little bit off mic about how most skills are pretty useful, but I'm thinking about, let's call them kind of frivolous skills.
Frivolous is a good way to say it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Something that, isn't really necessary. It's kind of a nice to have. And I think for me,
yes,
I've got a few. One would be a cartwheel.
Perfect.
I was never able to do cartwheels as a kid.
Nor could I. No.
And I was always really envious of the kids who were just cartwheeling around the playground at school.
Yeah.
So if I could just hop up and do a cartwheel one day.
It's not going to impact your life in any way, but if you could do one, it'd be kind of cool.
Be kind of cool.
Yeah, yeah.
And I've always wanted to be able to be one of those people that could do the whistle with the fingers in the mouth.
That is actually kind of useful, though.
That's kind of useful.
Like if you want to get someone's attention, it's pretty amazing.
I've got to this point without
True.
having used it.
It's
but
not essential.
if I had it, I feel like that would be fun.
Yeah, that'd be really cool.
Yeah.
Imagine people you could call over for that. Yeah, just for the sake of it. Any thoughts for you, Michelle? Any frivolous skills?
Yeah, well, when you guys said this, there was lots of things that came to mind. But then actually when I thought about them, I was like, these are all great skills that could be actually quite useful. So a skill that I would really love to have is just to be able to hold my breath for a really, really, really long time.
Yeah.
So I could be underwater for a really long time.
Do some free diving.
And my husband is quite good at most things, and he's very good at holding his breath. So that could be something in life that I was better at than him. There's not many things.
We love those skills.
I like that. Yes. I can't hold my breath for very long at all. And the more I think about it, the more I panic about it and I'm up again. Like I'm just not underwater for very long. Look, I think we're looking at a few physical skills here, it seems. And for me, it would be the first thing that came to mind was a handstand. I can't do a handstand.
Yeah.
And, people do it for yoga, right? But I don't think you have to use it. I've never done that.
No.
And what's the point of it? And I was watching, the CrossFit things that people do. They do these push-ups on handstands. I'm like, well, why?
Yeah.
But kind of fun and cool if I could do it. Like,
So full disclosure, I did have a little CrossFit era.
Did you?
In my time. But I was useless at the handstands. It had to be against a wall and it had to be someone holding my legs up just in case. Yeah.
I feel like for a 9 or 10-year-old girl, cartwheels and handstands are an essential skill.
Yes.
Yeah.
If you go to a soccer match for 9 and 10-year-old girls, a lot of cartwheels and handstands going on out there.
Not so much soccer, but
yeah, a bit of soccer as well.
Yeah, splashed in there. Yeah. This is nice. Could have I would love to do a chin up. Like I've survived all this time now. I haven't fallen over the side of a building. I always think I should do one chin up.
You're not Tom Cruise.
Yeah, exactly. So
okay.
I could get myself up if I fell over a balcony or something. That hasn't happened, but it's
you never know.
I feel like a chin up's a pretty achievable one.
We could get you a resistance band.
Yeah, I think I need all those things. And I need a place where no one can watch me and judge me.
Yeah.
That's probably probably what I need to do. But anyway, I digress. That's a good skills-based one. I see what you did there.
Yeah.
I see what you did there. Okay.
Always thinking.
Always thinking. Let's get into what we'll be talking about with Michelle today. So, in this study, the research team developed a 21-item Fidelity tool to help clinicians implement evidence-based guidelines for improving function in children with cerebral palsy. Designed for goal setting, intervention and reflection, the tool is found to be practical and useful, but face some challenges like time constraints and family expectations. The study highlights the need for education, self-reflection and organisational support to bridge the gap between research and practice. And bridging the gap between research and practice is our favourite topic.
Always. Always. So, Michelle, for anyone who didn't listen to our first episode with Michelle, I would encourage you to go to the back catalogue, find that episode, listen to that, and then come back here. But we will also do a bit of a rehash on the functional guidelines that Dana talked about just then and we talked about in your bio. Can you give us a summary on what the best practice principles are and how you and the team developed those?
Yeah, so those guidelines that came out, I think, almost 5 years ago now, 4 or 5 years ago, really came about because, in the last 20 years, there's been such a big change in what we know works really well in rehabilitation and best practice in terms of OTs, physios, and everyone else that helps people with cerebral palsy or other conditions. The big difference between 20 years ago and now is that we know that if we really want to improve function, so the things that people really, really want to do, that we need to, for a start, ask them what they want to be able to do and also really focus on practicing the thing that they want to do and really considering, them doing that thing in a broader context of, where they want to do it and that sort of thing. And that was a really big change in thinking, actually. It probably at the moment perhaps second nature to a lot of us. But, it's been a really big shift, especially if you speak to people who, went to uni sort of 30 years ago or so. It's a big shift in thinking. Yeah, so the best practice principles in those guidelines really, focused on those things. So this key piece around asking people what was really important to them and setting goals around what was most important to the person. But then also really focusing our intervention on specifically on that goal. So rather than really assuming that if we changed someone's underlying, muscle tone or muscle strength, that it would have these carryover effects, rather than starting with the actual activity and what the person wanted to do, and then really individualising how we helped based on where that person was at with that goal at that point in time. And there's lots of things from research that we know really help with that now in terms of, trying to practice the whole goal as much as possible. And we know that if we make it really fun and people are enjoying themselves, that our brain has more capacity to learn and improve. So that's really important. And we know that idea of practicing within context, so, home or in someone's community or at their school, depending on what the goal is really, really important. And we know that we also really need to think about how much practice is needed, because for certain interventions, more practice dose is needed than other interventions. And we know that it's, especially when we're working with kids, we know it's really, really important to consider their family unit and what works well for the whole family. So it's sort of the best practice principles in a bit of a nutshell.
Love it.
That was pretty good.
Yeah. A great rehash, I would say.
Yeah, that's right.
So, Michelle, this is I suppose, one of the next steps or a continuation of that work. Can you talk to us about the key motivation for developing this Fidelity tool that looks at how the clinical practice guidelines are implemented and why this was one of the things that you decided to do following on from that?
Yeah, well, we know that guidelines are really important. They're a really great first step for us to understand what is research telling us is best practice. And so we know that it's really important to have those guidelines in place. But we also know that guidelines on their own don't really lead to changes in practice for clinicians, and therefore don't really lead to changes in what people with cerebral palsy and their families are able to receive. So I suppose there's lots of factors in this jump between research and actually changing practice. And a Fidelity tool, I suppose, is one of those tools or things that we can use to try and support people to start thinking about, clinicians to start thinking about how they might be able to change them. Because it is really hard, as a clinician, it's really hard to keep up to date with evidence, but also, it's hard to, especially, when we feel really comfortable and confident with interventions that we use often, it's, it's challenging for us to use new and different interventions and challenge ourselves to try different things with people that we're working with. So the idea with this Fidelity tool is that I suppose it's one step towards hopefully supporting people to align a little bit more closely with those clinical practice guidelines.
Yeah,
that's beautiful.
It's a really good point, because I think, it's one thing to know what best practice is and what the evidence base tells us. It's a whole nother thing entirely, and quite overwhelming, I imagine, for some people to think, okay, but what does that look like for me in my day-to-day practice? How do I actually take what I'm reading on this page or what I'm hearing as what we should be doing and apply that in my everyday work?
Yeah.
So I think that's one thing, but also let's dive into this concept of a Fidelity tool. We touched on it as it applies to the practice guidelines, but what is a Fidelity tool? What are we using them for? How do we develop them?
Yeah, so a Fidelity tool is essentially a bit of a checklist, and it can be used. So lots of specific interventions have Fidelity tools, and they're a bit of a checklist to be, I suppose, checking your current practice against a specific intervention, or in this case, against specific guidelines.
Yeah.
But it's really, I suppose, a practical way of being able to reflect on or observe something that's happening, so your own practice or someone else's practice, to really break it down to see whether there's, aspects that you might find really easy and do really well, and perhaps other areas that are a little bit more challenging. And all of it, that's going to be the case for all of us for any intervention that we use. We're never going to get it perfect and right every time.
Yeah.
But the idea with the Fidelity checklist is that we can just really reflect on things perhaps that are really straightforward and simple and easy for us.
Yep.
And perhaps those areas that maybe we could spend a little bit of time understanding a little bit more. And I think the great thing about most Fidelity tools is they break things down in a really practical way and give quite real world examples of what what each aspect of a guideline or an intervention might look like. Because I think another thing that we know about paediatric rehabilitation interventions is that often an intervention is named in the literature, but it might be really consistent from one intervention to the next, or from one research study to the next, what people have actually done. And so something like a Fidelity tool enables us to understand more about what someone has actually done, to then enable us to understand whether that has been effective or not.
Yes.
I think it's sort of a quick and easy checklist, but also gives some really beautiful clinical examples that give a little bit more clarity around some things. Especially, we've all got different perspectives on what something like task-specific training looks like.
Yes.
And so, the guidance document that goes alongside this Fidelity tool, I suppose, breaks it down to give people a bit of a picture of, as a guideline authorship group, what we would see each of those aspects of the guideline looking like in the real world.
I love that. I love everything about that, because you're absolutely right. You can name the active ingredients from, best practice guidelines, but they're quite broad and yes, open to interpretation. I've certainly seen things before where they go, this is functional and task specific. And I do look at it and go, really? Like how? But they call it that. And just by calling it that doesn't mean it necessarily is. But this is a great moment to reflect on that, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And I think, it's great that we all think differently about things, but we, when we think about sort of best practice and what we know works from the research, it's great to be really clear about what that is.
Yeah. I love that. Yeah. Well, let's dive into it now. So the Fidelity tool itself is published in the paper, so please, everyone go and have a look at it, and as well as all the supplementary material too, as Michelle had discussed, but we'll talk about it. So the tool has about 21 items. So can you walk us through some of the most critical components and why they were chosen? I know there's a whole methodology around it.
Yeah, so the process, that you go through when you're developing a Fidelity checklist is really around like looking at the components of an intervention or the guideline and then thinking more practically about what that will look like in clinical practice. And we know that for each item, you really similar to when we're writing GAS goals, it's really important to really only have one change component in each aspect of the Fidelity tool. And so that was the aim for each of the items in the Fidelity tool, that there wasn't lots of different components that could change, that there was just one component. So when we broke it down into, the how well are you adhering to this, that it was really clear in terms of a specific aspect of that skill or that activity, whether people were aligning with it. So we tried a few different things and we ran it through a few different people, but in the end, we sort of broke it down into 3 specific areas, the Fidelity tool. So the first section is around goal setting and what we would hope or expect to see when people are setting goals. Yes. And the second section was around the intervention and, if people are working on functional goals with children with CP, the really critical pieces that we would see it's really important during intervention. And then I suppose some of those more general best practice principles that we would hope that clinicians would carry out throughout the intervention around, the way that we communicate with families and really aiming to empower families. So that's sort of, I suppose, how it was broken down into those key pieces to really try and reflect, each item in the guideline.
And Michelle, I'm really interested in how you see this Fidelity tool being used clinically by physiotherapists and occupational therapists. What does that how do you envision that looking day to day for them?
Yeah, it's such an interesting idea actually, because I think it's really hard to envisage that, but I think it'll be really different depending on where you are in the world and what kind of organisation you work for and that sort of thing. So I imagine it would be quite different for lots of different people. I think that we hoped that people would be able to use this tool in whatever way worked for them. I think when we originally went into this idea of developing a Fidelity tool, we thought that it perhaps would be a good tool for organisations to use and for managers to use with their staff. But probably the more we discussed it practically with people, clinicians didn't necessarily feel really comfortable with other people. They felt like, assessing them using the tool. Yeah. They didn't feel comfortable videoing themselves to use the tool. So clinicians really felt like it would be more helpful for them and they would be more open to using the tool as a self-reflection tool.
Right.
Some people more than others. And I think there was a lot of discussion around, for clinicians perhaps who are really experienced and are used to doing a lot of self-reflection or videoing themselves, they might have been more open to it. But perhaps clinicians with less experience, it was a little bit more confronting. So it probably, and in Australia, probably a lot of our practice aligns quite closely already, with these guidelines and Fidelity tools, but that's really different around other parts of the world where, they might still be, undergraduate university OT and physio degrees might still be teaching perhaps what was taught in Australia 30 years ago. So, it can be a really big jump, if you see a list of this is what you should be doing in practice and you're like, wow, I'm really not doing any of these things. And that can feel really different to, wow, most of these things really
of course.
Well. So I think we hope that people will use this in whatever way works best for them. And if that is just a tool that they can read and understand more about, what both each different aspect, so each different item of the Fidelity tool, what that clinically might look like in practice. And certainly for students and new graduates, they thought that guidance document that goes alongside the Fidelity tool was really helpful because of the practical examples that it gave of, this what we would see as, really best practice.
Yep.
And this perhaps is what we would suggest is not really aligning with the guidelines.
Yep.
And some people were really surprised, actually. Some people who felt like they, for example, set goals really beautifully with clients were kind of like, oh, wow, I'm really not doing that step at the moment, so I probably need to work on that. So, I think people can use it in different ways. I think, when we developed it initially, we thought that it could be used by supervisors to support people working in their organisation, but perhaps it will be used differently to that. Yeah. And I'm not sure that it necessarily be a day-to-day thing, but I think, it would be great if clinicians out there, it could be a bit of a tool that they could refer back to or something that they could perhaps reflect on after an intervention session as, part of their PD or supervision, something like that.
I love that. And I love that, it means different things to different people, because one of the things I was thinking about is, for some people in the first instance, this could just be an awareness raising tool, like having those elements in front of them about what is evidence-based practice. For some people, that might be the first they're hearing or seeing of that. And, as you said, that will be very different depending on where you are in the world and what organisation you work for. Yeah. But, to use it for yourself and to see how what you're doing aligns with the best practice guidelines and to have really concrete practical examples of that, I think it's, a really powerful tool for people to take on board and use it in whatever way they would like to.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And I even think, my head goes in so many different directions for this in terms of uses. I can see already that, I do some work in some developing countries. And so when you want to try to teach the idea of this, which is so, like you said, Michelle, so different to how they would have been trained, this can be very confronting. So you can actually just break it down. Each week we're going to focus on this. What does it mean that they're client chosen? That's a big deal. That's quite different to how so many clinicians were trained. I remember how I was trained. It's different to how we do it now. But you can go through it in a really non-threatening way of going, this is what it could look like. These are some great examples of what it could be really great for and to build into that. Yeah. But I think in our current practice as a researcher, we talk about fidelity all the time. So we're also very used to, in our setting, to go, all right, have we performed this intervention like we said in the protocol? Yeah. And so from that perspective, so many of us be like, that's great. I want to see that I'm on track with this. Am I implementing it? So you've got the other end of it. Yeah. But you can see how it would work across the spectrum. Yeah. And I love that. I love that you've created something that anyone can use for their situation. So it's brilliant.
Yeah. I think as well about clinicians who might have been working in this area for a really long time and have some really long-standing, long-held beliefs about, practices that they are implementing day to day. This is a really, providing it in this way is a really gentle, non-confrontational way of supporting them to reflect on their practice and how they might want to, start to take pieces of that and perhaps change or, develop what they're doing.
Make those choices themselves.
Without that pressure
That's
of,
right.
Yeah.
Michelle, was there anything particular in, you sort of mentioned, obviously you had working groups and you were going through explaining, what task specificity, that always gets my attention because there's a lot of different interpretations of that. But was there anything else that really stuck out that had a lot of conversation around that you really wanted to make sure was addressed through these other supplementary materials?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think within, the group that was involved in the Fidelity tool, probably that concept of whole task practice was the one we had the most discussion around.
Yeah. Yes.
In terms of looking at it from an idealistic perspective or a realistic perspective. And I think that's one that, lots of really experienced, amazing people have different ideas about whether the whole task practice is necessarily really realistic from the outset or whether part task practice is always needed. So that's probably the one that we had the most discussion about, I suppose, and people felt quite differently about, which is great, like a really healthy discussion where people think differently about things is fantastic. Yeah. And, but it was really interesting, having to break down, ideally what would this look like and, what's an example of what this wouldn't look like and then what does it look like in between. Like that was a really interesting process to go through.
Yeah, I love that. spectrum of idealistic to realistic and how, things might have to change or not change, but
to be considered along that. I think it's really interesting. Can we talk about that whole task one? Because obviously it's something that we think about a lot and we have discussions all the time. Where did it land? How would you define, I suppose, a whole task in the most ideal way of what we should be doing in our interventions? What should we be aiming for? What does that look like?
Yeah, I think, and I probably am more on the idealistic end. I should let you know,
declare.
I think in my mind, like whole task practice is around really thinking about, the person's big participation goal and what they want to do, and really working from I can see them in my mind, or they can see themselves in their minds doing this task. And so how can we get them in there? How can we start doing this straight away?
Yes.
And then so really from the outset, focusing on, we want to get them doing this thing in the environment and the context with the people around them that they want to do it with.
Yes.
And then if that's not, if we get to that point and give it a go and it's not working, then perhaps we break it down into smaller pieces and start addressing, particular barriers or, particular parts of the task or, a skill we might need to break down for the person to eventually get there. So I think for people, traditionally lots of people felt like part task practice was a necessary step in leading to whole task practice of things. So I think I think it'd be great to challenge ourselves a little bit to think about whether that is always a necessary step, or whether we could be flipping it around a bit and thinking about sort of that whole task, the big picture participation before thinking about it.
It's a great call out, really, to challenge that, because it's certainly, I'm the same as you, I would say, in terms of how I'd see a whole task. It's like, how can we make it possible? What equipment can we use? What adaptations can we use? And let's make this happen. And, it calls on this creativity element as well of what could be possible for that person to engage, be involved, not just attend. I kind of think of it from that perspective. But then I can also see on the counter of that, we've often do have discussions, and I had one quite recently where it was a discussion around head control, head and trunk control. And my question to this person who was really wanting to look at how can we improve head and trunk control and measure it, how many degrees that could look like. And my thought was, okay, well, where does this sit when it comes to participation? Like, how much change is enough change where participation is then impacted? And there was just obviously we didn't agree because we were looking at things from such a different perspective. And I kind of go, if we're building up head and trunk control till they're able to do it, we're going to be here for a really, really long time and missing out on these opportunities where they can do it. Whereas I just go, let's find a way to make it happen. But there are really strong pulls still to really break it down into its body structure and function. But not to negate and say they're not important. No. Spasticity is still important. Strength is still important. And my mind is I go do whole task, and then we can also support that person's well-being by making sure they're still strong and making sure that they are having the right interventions for postural interventions like botulinum toxin. But it's kind of addressing it that way rather than the bottom up, quite literally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I suppose you don't know what exactly they need for a specific goal unless you see them, having a go at that goal in the context that they want to do it in. And then you might be able to, make modifications and tailor things in a way that supports them to do that.
That's right.
Safely and effectively, but you don't know unless they're giving
doing
it a go.
Yeah. I mean, this is already a discussion, right? So if they need a little bit more strength and they can't quite get in their race run and get as far as they want to, well, clearly we need to work on fitness and clearly we need to work on positioning. So let's sort that in this position. And then they're still doing it and they can get better at it. And then they're encouraged to do it rather than the incremental. So yeah, it's such a variety change. And when I remember bringing that up in that conversation, I was shot down. They're like, oh no, participation. Like, why? We need to focus on body structure and function here. Like, this is important. You're too participation focused. And I'm like, oh, there's the two ends there. I don't know. Thoughts on that, Michelle? I've talked a lot there.
Yeah. It's so interesting, isn't it? And I think it's hard when, I think when you think really similar to people, like I think probably we think really similarly about it. But I think there's lots of people out there that, you know, really feel like, you know, addressing those underlying impairments is a really critical piece. And I certainly am not saying those things similar to you are not important. Of course, they're really important. And, you know, we always need to consider those things. But I think, you know, it's really important when we're having discussions about something like, you know, the number of degrees we're able to lift our head or something like that is really coming back to, you know, well, what is it? You know, what did the person say they wanted to do? Like, what's most important? What's it going to look like when this happens? Like, like so really going back to like why is this important to the person, and you know, how much time and effort are we going to spend on them being able to lift their head an extra 5 degrees or 10 degrees? What's that going to mean for them?
What's it going to mean? Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and I kind of think a little bit about, you know, so much of what we do has been informed by lived experience, and so we have so many adults with cerebral palsy who have said, enough now, like, you know, let us do what we want to do. Let us get on with it. And when I think about, you know, if they're in their 30s and their 40s and they're saying that, or let's think back 30, 40 years ago, we were body structure and function focused. We just were. Yeah. It was a medical model, and improving that little bit more of head control, that little bit more strength here and there without participation has still led to them coming back to say, hey, no, thank you. I want to do what I want to be able to do. So I kind of go, if we want to stick with that, well, we've got lived experience informing us that we should probably look at things a different way as well. Yeah. So, and this is where I think a tool like this creates that kind of conversation, which is a healthy conversation to have. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think it is a healthy conversation. And I think, you know, it's great that people think differently about things. I'm not, you know, I don't expect us all to think the same way. But yeah, I think it's great to challenge. Again, I think it's great to challenge ourselves and have a think about, you know, like, why are we doing this? Is this really most helpful for them?
The why is very important.
Absolutely.
For sure.
Yeah.
So, Michelle, I feel like we've touched on this a few times in our conversation so far, but let's kind of focus now on challenges to implementing things like these evidence-based interventions and guidelines. What are some of the biggest challenges that clinicians face when trying to implement evidence-based interventions for cerebral palsy?
Yeah, I think there's so many challenges, and I think that we've already spoken about the fact that those challenges look really different in different parts of the world. Yeah. Because we know that education, for a start, and you know, even in places like Australia, for a lot of clinicians, upskilling and having access to the most up-to-date evidence and the most up-to-date training, and you know, really upskilling and you know, having really current knowledge and then being able to implement that knowledge in practice. It's really, really hard. Yeah. And it's hard, you know, for clinicians to keep up with the current evidence, let alone be able to access all the current training to align with best practice evidence. So I suppose I could probably speak to an Australian context. I think, you know, time is probably one of the biggest things that lots of clinicians in Australia say, you know, it's really hard to find time to do things like reflecting on your practice and taking the time to stop and fill out something like a Fidelity tool, or, you know, video yourself in a session and then have the time to review it. I think especially in this space of, you know, private practice and NDIS funding, where people don't necessarily have as much time for professional development as they used to. Yeah. So time is a big one, but I think time is probably the one that people cite for everything in life and clinical life, right? Yeah. So it's probably about, you know, committing to things and finding time. But I think there's also in Australia, and certainly the clinicians that were involved in the pilot for this said that there was lots of other barriers in terms of organisational stuff. So for clinicians who had really supportive managers who encouraged people to take time and sort of, you know, made a time together with the clinician around when they were going to take the time to reflect on their practice, or when they were going to upskill and read about something that they wanted to change. So the organisation that you work for and, you know, your direct line managers made a really, really big difference. Yes. To whether it was possible, I suppose, for you to find time in your own work life to do something like this. But also one of the really interesting things that came up that I was surprised about actually in this was that a lot of clinicians felt like families actually didn't want to spend a lot of time on goal setting. So a lot of families apparently were feeling like goal setting was not a really important piece. They'd already done that, perhaps with their NDIS planner.
Right.
And so lots of clinicians had found that, families are saying to them, we don't necessarily want to spend an hour or two of our time on goal setting. So that was really surprising to me because I think if anything was going to be most helpful in our intervention, and I see goal setting as part of our intervention, if anything was going to be most helpful, it would be understanding what's most important, because if we don't know what's most important, it's really hard to know what's going to be most helpful and how we can be most helpful. But there was this really interesting, clinicians were saying there was not just pressure in terms of their workplace, but also pressure from the families that they were working with, and that there'd been this big change in Australia. Like, a lot of clinicians are going into schools now to work with kids, for example, rather than working directly with families, which made it really challenging for them to then achieve some of those fidelity items around involving families and making sure practice at home was happening and that sort of thing. So that was a layer that I probably hadn't anticipated, actually.
Wow. That is really interesting. And you think about, you're right. So in the last 20 years, things have changed for us from an industry perspective. But within our own, it's like a own little construct here, but, within Australia itself, we've got NDIS, and there are so many more stakeholders now, because you're right, they're setting goals at an NDIS level, and then it kind of gets brought down yet again, but they're probably setting goals, is it goal setting fatigue? They're doing it for their surgery or the botulinum toxin injections, and then they're doing it for this context. And then there's, bringing it together, that coordinated care sometimes can be tricky. And then there's also support workers are more involved now than ever before. And so you've got another lot of stakeholders involved. And sometimes they're the ones bringing them to therapy or to school and having those interactions. So it's really challenging, Michelle. What an interesting thing to have brought up and to go, okay, now we know this. What can we do about it?
And
it's really interesting.
And all of it, all those things that you've just touched on there, they all come back to time in one way or another, don't they? Time really is. It's time. Reflection takes a lot of time if you're doing it properly and thoroughly. It is a lot of time that you have to carve out of your practice to dedicate to that. Families feel like there's too much time taken up with the goal setting, and that perhaps they feel like that's taking away from other aspects of their child's care and the therapeutic interventions that are being provided for them. They don't really understand the context of how that goal setting fits within the program that's being provided. It all comes back to time.
It really does, isn't it? And I suppose from an education perspective, what we can do as clinicians is get good at helping to set goals, because that is a skill in itself, isn't it, Michelle? Like, setting a goal, sometimes being too open, going, so what are your goals, is not a great way to start the conversation.
You need to give the context, right? This is why we're doing, this is why it's important that we're doing this now for your child in this way.
That's right. Any hot tips there, Michelle? Because I think that's, goal setting is not as simple as saying we're setting a goal today.
No, it's not. It is such a great skill, and it's so interesting because OTs and physios actually they have beautiful skills at goal setting, and that's something, with the introduction of NDIS and people setting goals with their NDIS planners, that has changed a little bit because, planners' background, they don't necessarily have the beautiful skills of OTs and physios and other allied health professionals around setting goals. But I think I would just say to everyone, just take the time to get to know families and kids and say to ask them what's most important right now, what would make the biggest difference in your life. Because I think also a lot of the families that we work with, come to us as certain disciplines with preconceived ideas about the goals that they have to set. And we don't want it to be that way. We want them to be real and reflective of where they're at and where they want to go. They're really meaningful. That's a really good point.
I think we've touched on the fact that, the study around this Fidelity tool really highlights the gap between best practice and real world implementation on that, idealistic and realistic continuum. Can we talk a bit about strategies to try and bridge that gap? Because we know now, with the Fidelity tool, we know what best practice looks like. How do we support people to move towards, ticking every box on that checklist?
I think any kind of strategies to try and bridge that evidence to practice gap, I think needs to address lots of different factors. So we know that sort of policymaker and organisational factors play a really big piece. So I think that we need to have people, who are really advocating at that policy and organisational level, because it does make a big difference and does impact. If there's clinicians on the ground who want to change their practice and are not being given the opportunity to do that, then that's a really big barrier. And also on the flip side, if organisations are telling clinicians that they need to change their practice, that has a really big influence as well. And we know, I feel like we've probably spoken most today to the barriers, for clinicians. So we know that clinicians themselves need access to training, and also probably one of the other things that came up with the clinicians in this study was that your current practice and how closely you align with those guidelines makes a big difference around how open you are perhaps to changing your practice. So we need to figure out ways to support people in a really non-judgmental, open way, to be able to reflect on what they're currently doing and consider whether they'd be open to trying different things, but perhaps align a little bit more closely with evidence. But we also know that, people with lived experience and, the people we work with and their beautiful families, that we also need to support, their knowledge base. And I think depending on where you are in the world, actually now there's a lot of places in the world that are sort of, skipping over this idea of targeting clinicians for changing practice and are directly going to families, because then families be demanding from clinicians certain interventions, certain things. And so I think that's another way. And of course, this is your bread and butter, I suppose. You guys do it so beautifully with things like this podcast. You know what I mean? So there's lots of different strategies out there. And so I think, really thinking big picture and thinking about lots of different strategies to target all stakeholders and everyone involved are needed to change practice. And change is hard. We know that change is really hard, not easy.
There's actual roles and positions that are called change. They actually manage change in organisations.
I was just thinking of those people. I can't remember what they're called. Like names. Not change innovators or something. I suppose different places will give them different fancy labels. But
the fact that you have someone who does that just shows that changing behaviour is hard. It's really hard.
There's a whole field of research dedicated to it.
That's right.
Change is difficult and it's really hard to break habits.
It is, absolutely is. Yep. But there's a great, if we can put resources out there and support people with it, that's another piece of the puzzle. What would your key message be for an allied health professional who's working out there right now and they're working with children with cerebral palsy? What would be your sort of, take-home message for them as they hear about this Fidelity tool for the first time and are thinking about how they can put it in place?
Yeah, I suppose, if people are keen to change, we would love to support them in any way that we can. And there's actually, for this Fidelity tool, there's lots of, it's freely available online, and all the stuff you need to use it is freely available online. And there's also a couple of great training videos freely available online on the Cerebral Palsy Alliance website.
Wow.
So it's really easy to access. The training video is about an hour and the documents are all there, and we've made them as brief as possible.
Amazing.
So hopefully this would be a tool that, it's easy for people to access at least and should be fairly quick for them to learn about. And I guess I would just love to acknowledge the bravery of any clinicians who are like, right, I'm going to take this on and see whether there's any parts of my practice perhaps that I could do a little bit better and change. And I think it's amazing if we can really approach things with that growth mindset rather than approaching things from the perspective of, identifying perhaps what we're doing wrong or not doing well enough, really approaching things and using this tool to perhaps identify what we're doing really well and then maybe areas that we could do a bit better. So it would be great to. In Australia, we're not amazing at doing that. I think we all want, we all want to get it right every time. We want, that's really unrealistic, and we would never expect that of anyone else. So we shouldn't expect that of us.
Yeah.
Well, it's a strengths-based lens, isn't it? Not just for our kids, but for ourselves as well.
Right. Yeah. It comes with good intentions, right? Like we all want to think that we're doing the best by the families and the kids that we're working with. So it does require a bit of vulnerability and bravery to really take the time to reflect on what you are doing and how that aligns with what the evidence suggests.
Thank you so much for your time today, Michelle. It was so lovely to speak with you. The time difference means it's much later in the afternoon for you. So kids are probably coming home from school, all those kinds of things. But so thank you so much.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's a delight.
Yeah. Always nice to have people back.
Yes, so, which means we'll probably ask you to come back again. So when you have your next publication again, you'll know we'll be knocking on your door. So to all of our listeners, hope you really enjoyed that as well. We'll pop links for this for sure on our website, researchworks.net, and all the links that Michelle was talking about as well on the Cerebral Palsy Alliance page. We'll pop them all there too. Yep. Please go and have a look. It's a free. Fantastic resource.
It's free. It's accessible. Yep. It's,
barriers are being knocked down everywhere.
Go and check it out.
Definitely go check it out. And just hope you enjoyed it. So we'll talk to you all again next time.
Bye.
Bye.